So WatchMojo is such a success story, especially in the world of sort of like social streaming. But for those who aren't super familiar with it, can you give us a very brief overview of WatchMojo, its history, and your long tenure with the company?
Sure. So we launched about 15 years ago. We launched at the same time as YouTube, and we could see that YouTube was this, leading platform that was going to probably suck all the watch time and engagement from the rest of the media landscape. So we started off very horizontal. We wanted to have a video on every topic as we informed and entertained audiences that were moving to online and, mobile. And by 2012, we realized that there was a really big demand for serving basically what we call geek culture. These kids who were reading comic books, they had grown up and they were decision makers on Hollywood, Madison Avenue, Silicon Valley, and Wall Street. And we really started to serve that audience with our signature top 10 lists.
And when it comes to that audience, what was the type of stuff that performed over the years you found really well on social streaming? Fandom culture, that type of stuff does really well. And what did you find actually didn't work super well?
Sure. So, all content, even Wall Street Journal, everybody has a formula. So for us, we recognize that the entertainment vertical was just going to be really big because if you're looking for a recipe, it's in and out. But if you're a fan of Star Wars, you're going to spend a lot of time engaging with that content. And then, as I like to say, we did not invent top 10, the format, Letterman, Wayne's World, and Moses, the OG of the lists. We knew that there was always a demand around that format. So we kind of really gravitated towards that. And then finally, because we had relationships with rights holders, we were comfortable to undertake fair use risk. If you were a traditional media company, you might have done reasons to watch Game of Thrones, but you were iffy to show the scenes. We were showing you all the best clips and whatnot. And finally, by betting on YouTube, we could track what people liked. So even though early on we would have some success, let's say doing the origins of Batman, or who the Joker is and all that, very quickly we could see that when we did top 10 Batman scenes, it was just a format that people gravitated to because there was this payoff, right? You may not be a fan of the topic, but you'll sit through it because it's both kind of informational and everybody is kind of curious to see what that number one entry is.
Letterman and Moses, the creators of the list. I absolutely love it. So you have started out in YouTube. Obviously I see you guys everywhere. You're Facebook, you're everywhere. But you're YouTube specialists. How many subscribers now across your channels do you have on YouTube? And can you just walk me through what has been the evolution of being a creator on YouTube from the early days back in 2007, 2008, all the way to now?
Sure. So YouTube has gone through a lot of iterations. I gave the keynote at VidCon about this. And so you went through pirated content, right? The lazy Sundays and the Comedy Central clips. And then you had the do-it-yourself how-tos. You also had then the rise of music videos on the platform and Let's Play gaming. So I would say that for us, we were a bit trying to do a little bit of everything. And so when we produced, let's say, gaming videos that we would license to IGN, we would also dump them on YouTube. If we did fashion videos way back for Glam, we would also put them on YouTube. And admittedly, YouTube is like Bizarro World. It's not like NBC where you might watch SNL, you might watch the news, you might watch a drama series. When you subscribe to a channel on YouTube, you're very, very much expecting content that is similar in style and length and tone and vertical and all that. So once we decided that, hey, traditional media, they're still not going to embrace YouTube. They're going to treat YouTube as a pariah, but we could see that YouTube was actually emerging as the belle of the ball. We recognized that not just because of what our passion points was around entertainment, pop culture, ranking, and lists, we could also see that, well, wait a minute, if music, for example, is going to be a huge category, but the rights holders, the record labels are very aggressive with Content ID, that created a vacuum combined with the lack of economic incentive for us to fill that vacuum. So we really focused both on serving the fans, but admittedly there was a business opportunity that we said, hey, while traditional media in Hollywood tries to figure out if YouTube is a friend or a foe, eventually it was more of a frenemy, we kind of viewed it as our favorite trading partner and we went all in. And so we started off very horizontal in terms of editorial and distribution. We were on all the portals. We were one of the first digital media players on Hulu. Once we kind of said, look, guys, let's stop kidding ourselves. YouTube is ground zero for video. We went all in. And then like everything else, it was a regression to the mean where a few years ago, yeah, we thought maybe Facebook would be our number two. Snap emerged at number two. Although this year, Facebook is giving Snap a run for its money. And, just as we start to get kind of good on a platform, then we're like, oh, wow, TikTok, Triller, all these other ones. So you've got to constantly innovate and adapt your content programming. Venture capitalists talk about this concept of product market fit. I always refer to platform format fit. there's always a right length, a right style, a right tone for a given platform. And indeed, we're very lucky. We were smart and we recognized the opportunity, but there was a lot of luck and timing to come around when YouTube was just emerging.
So right now you have the emergence of something like TikTok, which you noted, Snapchat, which you noted. These are vertical video platforms, which is so different than what you're doing on a horizontal video platform like YouTube. Do you think in the future we're going to see it like a 50-50 split and your horizontal is on smart TVs, on your desktop, and most mobile video is vertical? Or what's that division going to be like?
Sure. So I didn't answer your question. We have 45 million subscribers on YouTube, 23 million on the core flagship English language WatchMojo alone. So to answer your question, indeed, I think that if you look at all the different variables that you could tweak, whether it's the length, whether it's the style, whether it's how it's packaged, the vertical horizontal one is actually, in my humble opinion, maybe one of the lesser stringent variables to play with. Like the challenge was taking, let's say, our top 10 and adapting it into something for Snap, where it's a different, environment. It was less about the vertical versus horizontal. Now, I won't lie. If you are a UGC company, like let's say you're Jukin Media, that is going to be a bigger deal for you because you're just getting tons of videos coming in vertical. So to move into another kind of packaging where you need it to be in horizontal, that's a bit more of a leap of faith. That's a little bit more of let's go back to the drawing board. In our case, it's professionally produced social video. So we control the dynamics. And so making the adjustment to a platform like Snap was actually pretty easy, irrelevant of the horizontal versus vertical. But I think the bigger hurdle to jump at is more just recognizing that because Facebook and YouTube and Snap are all similar compared to TV, they're all fundamentally different platforms. And they're also fundamentally different platforms because on Facebook, we've talked to them for years and they themselves admit that, hey, it's sometimes frustrating to be the guys in charge of video within Facebook because Mark Zuckerberg has 50 things he's chasing after. And video is one of like 30 things. So you have to, as a producer, as a storyteller, kind of put yourself in the shoes of the platform and recognize, well, YouTube is going to be everything video, only video. It won't give up that. But when you're kind of like chasing Facebook, sometimes they may kind of send a signal to storytellers and then they move on to something else. And that's where I feel a lot of companies ended up tripping and hurting themselves because they just took what Facebook said at face value, not recognizing the context that, well, this is one of 20 things they're chasing today. Things will change.
Yep, that's something I hear about from the news industry every day, certainly. Yep. I want to talk about something you mentioned, which was Hulu and connected TV. Now, obviously, you started out in sort of the traditional social media streaming. Now we're seeing this huge rise of living room streaming. What does that mean for your business?
Great question. So everybody suffers from innovator's dilemma, right? So we were able to crush it on YouTube because we did not have a plan B. We were not also producing, let's say, text content on an O&O. We were not necessarily, that beholden to the portals. It wasn't lucrative enough for us to just be totally devoted to them, for lack of a better word. So when YouTube came, we went all in. Like we literally said, let's burn the boats. Admittedly, we had a challenge early on to devote resources to, let's say, like a direct to consumer OTT play of ourselves. It was always a question of like, well, do we put 100% of our energy into YouTube or this other thing that's maybe more proprietary, but still beholden to some other kind of like, platform risk. Now, the fundamental difference for me was I always said, when I looked at the back end, and we care about the content. We don't just look at the analytics and make decisions like that. But the times when we would look, I would say, well, wait a minute. Mobile is probably the number one platform in terms of market share on YouTube. It's bigger than desktop. However, we could see very early that connected TVs was where the growth was. It was just growing much, much faster. So I would tell my team, I said, guys, we are already crushing it on OTT and CTV, connected TV devices, but it's through YouTube. So we made a concerted effort to just stay devoted and loyal to YouTube. But what's happening now for us is we're looking at, okay, what does that lean back experience look like? How do we draw from our catalog to maybe repurpose some old content, which is evergreen, but it's again going back to the packaging, to every day when we have new output, is there a way that the same way we say, hey, we got to have a version for Snap, a version for Instagram, a version for Facebook, is there also a version of that for an OTT delivery environment? And then third, where I'm really excited, is I'm saying, hey, were basically building MTV and ESPN. I've always said the same way that those companies were very early on cable, huge market share in 1980, smaller market share, but much bigger valuable pie. So we also, I feel like we were early on YouTube. But if you look at what's happened in the AVOD space, at least, of OTT, you had players like, I was there with Farhad when he was building AdRise, which became Tubi. And so that's been acquired by Fox. Pluto launched, and they've been acquired by Viacom. So generally speaking, what's going to happen, history repeats itself, is these companies are going to start to more and more, as much as they're meant to be left alone, they're going to start to be more aligned with their corporate alignment. So there's actually, I wouldn't call it, people always talk about innings. I look at it more as like a best of 7 series. I would say YouTube, that's like game 4. It's still relatively early, but AVOD is definitely just the second match. It's very early. There's still a lot of opportunities, and that is an area that we're actually concentrating on more and more going forward.
Now, one of the questions, though, with AVOD, and I got to ask you this as a creator, I keep hearing all the time when it comes to CTV that there's going to be the same amount of measurement and fraud and problems with CTV that we had with digital. So what does that mean for a creator like you? Are you optimistic that we're going to get to a point where it's easy to measure content across all of these video platforms? Or are we still going to be in a bifurcated world for a long time where no one really knows what metrics to trust?
It's funny because the first 10 years of building WatchMojo, I inadvertently, maybe because we're based in Montreal, I just was very close with like the ad tech community in New York, right? I mean, that was my posse. And I would be in these conferences and they would talk about all these things, GRP, fraud, measurability, and all that. So you actually asked 2 questions. I think a lot of the fraud is a big word, but I think a lot of the frustration with video early on was things that were not necessarily like illegal, but maybe more unethical. Things like taking a video, putting it in banner, auto-playing it next to an article, passing off a hamburger as a filet mignon. So that we never did, and I was like, that's not video. I used to quote Warren Buffett, you never know who's swimming naked till the tide goes down. I was like, YouTube, if the economics are sound, eventually the money will flow. So I think a lot of the frustration when I would be at these panels and conferences with the ad tech crowd around video was really more about just the placement being not necessarily good, right? I think the second question that you're asking is about this promise of digital and not relying on Nielsen and Comscore that are like not the problem or the solution. They were players, they were participants in like trying to solve TV. And I think that admittedly, OTT does give the possibility of like better everything, better measurement, better tracking. But by its very nature, because the web is not limited to whether it's 3 networks or 500 channels on a dial, it is boundaryless, right? That I feel you're still going to have a lot of frustrations, but different frustrations. You know what I mean? There's no reason why, for example, a Pluto and a Tubi are going to necessarily agree on standards today. Same way that like a Google, YouTube will not necessarily agree on standards, So I feel like most of the problem early on with digital video had to do with crappy placement. There was obviously fraud, but it was crappy placement. Whereas now you're just talking about a hyper-cluttered landscape where you have not just like the traditional big tech players like Facebook and YouTube and all that, but you then also have like the hardware makers like Samsung and whatnot. And then you have like the ad tech firms that are now kind of all IPOing and they have the wind in their backs that are all trying to kind of compete. So it's like different problems, but an improved ecosystem. Nobody could really look at what's happening now and say that it's worse than TV was. TV was a crapshoot, if you think about it, right?
Yep, the crapshoot that we lived with for many, many, many years. We have time just for one more question, and that's
Sure. Your
business model obviously leans a lot more heavily into licensing now, not just advertising. Walk me through that migration and why licensing is, in some cases, a stronger business than just relying solely on ads.
Well, it's funny because we started off in licensing where we would take our catalog and tell everybody you could access it for a flat fee. And we realized that was not going to scale. And we were basically biding our time for ad dollars to flow. So I actually think AVOD is the better place because that $75 billion ad market, COVID accelerated that shift. There's less live sports, there's less TV programming. That is not going to go to SVOD platforms, it'll go to AVOD. So I actually respectfully disagree. I think advertising is the better now. If by licensing you're describing more like producing shows for the Netflixes and producing shows for the others, I think that is a double-edged sword that producers should chase, should be open to, but it does take a totally different sensitivity. The worst thing that companies like not just WatchMojo, but Vice, Vox, BuzzFeed, all that crowd can make is take the people that have been producing digital and think that that's the way Hollywood development executives and people who give the big green light budgets at Netflix and whatnot are looking for. It's a totally different universe. The ROI is very different. The risk is much higher. You have to spend far more upfront than you do in digital. You also have to commit to a certain kind of content that leaves you far less room to tinker and iterate with. So it is possibly a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, but it absolutely also could lead to heartbreak.
Yep, and I totally hear what you're saying about having less flexibility. When you commit to a series, you are committing to it. This has been such an informative conversation, Ash. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much for yours. Thank you.